Everything you know about history is probably wrong. Not because you've been fed objectively wrong information, with the truth concealed through some grand conspiracy, but because the way we learn history in educational and academic environments, but also in the context of hobbies and entertainment, is inherently flawed. The way we approach the investigation of historical figures and events is, to put it mildly, embarrassingly shallow and superficial. So much so that many who get to call themselves historians and academics end up making a mockery out of the entire field. Therefore, in the following minutes, I will elaborate on why this is most definitely the case, by pointing out the shortcomings and inadequacies of the default philosophy that dominates academic discourse in the 21st century. Then, with a thorough understanding of the deficiencies of our current understanding of history, our horizons will be open for an improved, scientifically grounded method of investigating the past, one that allows us to understand it in all its ever-evolving, perpetual development, from the tiniest detail up to the largest of paradigms. So, let us begin with a critique of a popular approach towards explaining historical events, the one that you may hear in your college or university classrooms, or perhaps from your favorite history YouTuber. Namely, there seems to be a favored tendency of presenting historical events through personal narratives of highly influential and great historical figures and unique individuals as the main protagonists of these events, also known as the great man theory. The decisive historical role is attributed to the personality and natural attributes of the given historical figures, their greatness or malice, their personal plans and ambitions, leadership abilities, superior intellect, or divine inspiration. Despite being extremely intuitive and helpful for visualizing complex historical events, this approach ends up creating shallow caricatures of entire movements and social dynamics, personifying them into one single individual, which is nothing short of tragic for the pursuit of any meaningful historical analysis. Now, here's a few examples of what I mean by that. Firstly, the history of World War II is often retold as a consequence of the individual psychopathy and dark genius of Adolf Hitler, and a few others like him. His personal grand master plan to conquer the world because of his personal obsessions and phobias that he used to enchant the masses under his iron fist. Take one of Jordan Peterson's lessons as an example.
One of the things about Hitler was that he was very disgust sensitive, and a lot of his hatred for non-Aryans. So imagine inside the Aryan box, it was all uniform. Outside, it was all parasites and predators. Hitler bathed 4 times a day. And he was also an admirer of willpower, so he could stand like this for 8 hours in the back of a car. And the thing about conscientious people is they're very willpower oriented. He cleaned up all the factories. Like he went in there and fumigated them. It was part of the law. He went on a public health campaign to get rid of tuberculosis, and he got rid of the bugs in the factories as well. And he used Zyklon B. That's an insecticide, and that's the gas that he used in the gas chambers eventually.
Moreover, leaders of the communist movement, such as Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, or Josip Broz Tito, are often portrayed as power-hungry dictators who usurped revolutionary movements with their personal ambitions to subject entire nations under their tyrannical rule. Such one-man dictatorships are in fact a fetishized fantasy of the average Western liberal, who sees their beloved liberal democracy as the complete opposite of the tyrannical totalitarian nightmare over there in Russia and China, of those alien and faraway oriental dictatorships where everyone must succumb to the will of one maniac at the top. Such oversimplified, fantastical representations of, in actuality, very complex political and socioeconomic systems has been engraved into our subconscious, particularly when talking about actually existing socialism, and the supposedly totalitarian nature of socialist regimes, something I've already talked about in great detail in another video of mine. Here's a few examples of how ridiculous this kind of narrative sounds, with echoes of Red Scare propaganda and McCarthyism from the Cold War still haunting our collective imagination.
It was genocide, carried out by a dictator who wanted to keep Ukraine under his control, and would do everything in his power to cover it up for decades. And Joseph Stalin wanted complete control of it. Around the same time, Stalin introduced a 5-year plan that would eventually give him control of Ukrainian agriculture. In Ukraine, the plan gave Stalin direct control over grain production.
Tito had destroyed the last potential threat to his personal rule and came out on top. Congrats, Tito, I guess? By means of multiple purges over the years, Tito destroyed any potential rival to himself, making Yugoslavia reliant on him too much politically.
Furthermore, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is universally portrayed as a display of the evil and malice of one supervillain, who is steering the destiny of 100 million people and the entire country's military apparatus for the purposes of his own evil master plan to conquer the world. The whole government is portrayed as hostages to his impulsive mood swings, ideas, and commands.
And what you really have to understand here is how that history is transposed onto the brain of one man, this guy. But really, it's the story about what Vladimir Putin really wants. And Putin is hating this, while Putin himself starts to chip away at Russian institutions, making them weaker and weaker. He's silencing his rivals, and he's consolidating power in himself. But Putin can't handle this. He is in total denial. Like an ex-boyfriend who can't handle his ex-girlfriend starting to date someone else, Putin can't let Ukraine go. He won't let go.
And finally, one of my favorite examples of this shallow approach would be the event that triggered the First World War, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. This single act is often lazily attributed the sole responsibility for the start of World War I, as a display of maniacal terrorism by a Serbian teenager who, independently of all societal and geopolitical dynamics, single-handedly provoked the biggest conflict in human history at that point in time, with the pull of a trigger. Now, even though you may not see anything wrong in these examples, I assure you that, as soon as you're acquainted with the proper alternative, the defects in this approach will become more than apparent. Namely, in all 4 of these examples, we bear witness to a one-dimensional caricature, an idealistic oversimplification of, in actuality, extremely complex and multifaceted chains of events that would require hundreds of pages of proper analysis to even scratch their surface. What we often ingest in this form is the fast food of social sciences, the indolent and low-effort version of historical narratives that perfectly accommodates our embarrassingly bad attention spans and goldfish memory, while presenting itself as historical science of some sort. It's nothing but an insult to your intellect. The great man theory is a pure manifestation of the cult of the genius, of the hyper-individualist insistence that individual people are the sole sources of human ingenuity due to their inherent genetical and intellectual superiority, or, as it is often told, as a result of their tireless grind and hustle. This declaration presumes that all human beings are fully independent agents that interact with their environment through their free will, that live in a vacuum and are in no way conditioned by environmental factors that may be out of their control. They apparently possess full agency over their own traits, thoughts, and actions, and their genius is therefore worshipped as an admirable display of conscious individual brilliance. These geniuses are thus supposedly the driving force of history. They are the vessels of scientific, technological, spiritual, and societal progress, and represent the main characters, the protagonists of human history. They supposedly start wars, conquer nations, they build cities and monuments, they come up with inventions, they cure diseases, and so on and so on. A quick repudiation of this entire worldview doesn't require much. All that needs to be said is that it wasn't the pharaohs that built the pyramids, it wasn't Caesar who built the Colosseum, nor was it the emperors that built the Great Wall of China. It was workers, people like you and me who collectively toiled away for millions upon millions of hours, carrying billions of tons of building materials over their own backs to build these impressive landmarks. It wasn't the genius wizardry of any of these cults of personality that managed these impressive feats of construction. It was the collective effort of millions of minds and bodies accumulating and coordinating their abilities and knowledge throughout the millennia. learning and correcting each other perpetually and interdependently. It was not the individual heroes and geniuses, but the general intellect of the human race as a whole that discovered electricity and penicillin, that built skyscrapers, dams, and bridges, or that indulged in self-destructive annihilation through great wars and conquests. These individual people who we praise and put on pedestals for their achievements are not to be discredited, but rather viewed in the larger context of the general intellect, as mere fruits of the gigantic tree of human knowledge, as the personifications and embodiments of centuries of collectively accumulated knowledge and abilities that clicked in a certain way inside of the mind of that individual, that connected the dots and articulated ideas in a useful way. And this applies to all scientists, authors, engineers, designers, philosophers, etc. Steve Jobs, for example, didn't invent the iPhone in the sense that he invented every single component and technology required for the device to function and single-handedly manufactured every copy of the device. He is simply the face, the symbol of the rearrangement of existing, developed, and established technologies and methods in a particular way, through the labor and creativity of thousands of designers and engineers. Same goes for the likes of Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and others, who have appropriated the praise and credit for these achievements through the predatory exploitation and ultimate dismissal of the millions of minds that were involved in invention and production under their symbol. The ultimate conclusion here is that there is no genuinely independent and isolated action, thought, idea, or creativity. We all draw inspiration, knowledge, and ideas from those that preceded us, and we merely interpret the millions of inputs of those that have come before us. We rearrange their discoveries, separate the wheat from the chaff, and apply them to our current material conditions. Individuals are not mystical sources of innovative brilliance, but rather absorbers, interpreters, and personifications of accumulated collective wisdom. So why is it then that we tend to fetishize this cult of the genius, the great men and heroes, so piously? Why is it that we ignore the contributions and efforts of the general intellect, of the millions of workers and peasants, or forgotten and discarded thinkers and scientists of the Third World, whose efforts and achievements have been stolen and appropriated, but without whom none of this would be possible? Why are we stuck in this rigid dogma of hyper-individualism? The answer lies in a place very familiar to anyone who's ever seriously grappled with the deficiencies of our existing societal order, and should therefore not be surprising at all. Individualism is an ideological tool for the reinforcement and reproduction of the right on private property over the means of production. It grants individuals and their supposed brilliance the justification for holding productive forces of society in their own private hands. Plainly put, it explains away the injustices and exploitation of the many by the few, by the virtue of their supposed individual industriousness and brilliance, which supposedly justifies their place at the top of the pyramid. The prospect of the general intellect that we've previously described, the only intellectually honest way of analyzing societal innovation and historical developments, is discarded and ignored in favor of a rigid, static, dull-witted dogma of quote-unquote great men who single-handedly shape history through singular events of great importance. The fluid, dynamic general intellect is thus painted as the boogeyman, as the notorious hive mind that consumes and destroys all sense of individualism and personality, that values the collective at the expense of the individual, which is, funnily enough, for many a default presumption about communism. In essence, some fear this alternative, scientific method of observing history purely because of their ideological drive to conserve the status quo, to maintain their right to private property, and their self-righteous drive to stand above others, to dominate and exploit them. Their omnipresent dogma atomizes individuals and promises us that we are all special, that we all must fend for ourselves, clean our own room first, and not worry about wider societal problems. Those are supposedly handled by individuals wiser than ourselves. They are well aware that a different retrospective on human history, on our progress and achievements, a collectivist and internationalist one, threatens the hegemony of capitalism as the dominant socio-economic system, and simultaneously their private interests. It would make us realize that, just like history was steered and decorated by our shared collaborative efforts, the future is equally so in our collective hands, and not in the hands of a handful of supposedly great men. It would return agency to the laboring people of the earth, and give them hope that they have a common cause that they can pursue in a collaborative, organized manner. As you can see, that would be highly inconvenient. And some, on the other hand, dismiss this kind of nuanced approach due to pure egotism and obsession, with the prospect of one day themselves crystallizing as one such great genius or successful businessman. Their hope of one day profiting from the status quo, with narcissistic belief in their own self-righteous independence, makes them politically passive and impotent. It makes them the bootlickers of the current political establishment. Nonetheless, this entire theory and philosophical misunderstanding of societal dynamics is just a symptom of something deeper. Namely, it draws its roots from the 19th century philosophy of idealism, whose well-established foundations commit innumerable sins and fallacies that no person who fancies themselves as an enthusiast of social sciences, or let alone an intellectual, can possibly ignore. The only reason why this kind of erroneous philosophy is tolerated or encouraged is because, as we have already briefly mentioned, it is very useful for the agents of the status quo in more ways than one. Idealism is by all metrics an outdated philosophy, whose shortcomings and inadequacies have been exposed and refuted countless times for almost 200 years, by the likes of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and hundreds of intellectuals that followed in their footsteps. Yet, it's still entrenched in our collective subconscious as the dominant interpreter of history and modernity. It still prevails as the default mode of thought. So, what are these tragic shortcomings that I keep insisting upon? Well, among other things, idealism represents history as a series of isolated events and phenomena, of carefully defined and labeled piecemeal episodes in strict chronological order. It categorizes these events and phenomena with rigid, static definitions. For example, history is taught in schools as a series of dates you ought to remember, saturated with highly influential singular events, initiated by a set of important individuals that fully define rigidly defined epochs. The result is a mediocre movie script of linear and one-dimensional storytelling, which transforms history from a social science into a grocery list, or in the best case, into cheap entertainment. These stiff definitions and piecemeal categorizations of events oversimplify historical processes to the point of absurdity. They ignore the fluid and dynamic nature of historical development and focus merely on the episodic highlights of history that give us zero insight into the logic of its perpetual transformation. The result of this is a historical vacuum with isolated bubbles floating around, disconnected and independent of one another or of the greater context. The perceived cause and effect is strictly linear and one-dimensional. Complex historical processes are perceived as expressions of personal squabbles and clashes between individual leaders and aristocrats, occurring episodically and randomly, with the spectacle and intrigue of bourgeois and aristocratic politics as the centerpiece of this historical theater. Wars and international conflicts are not seen as symptoms of intricate socioeconomic mechanisms and social dynamics, but as the will of political leaders who have the ability to press a button and send everyone to smithereens if they so desire. Geopolitical conflicts are seen as master plans of individual leaders with a thirst for power. War crimes as spontaneous outbursts of hatred and resentment, and political alliances as expressions of the friendly attitude of leading personalities. So why do we then limit ourselves to this kind of shallow approach? Why is idealism so pervasive despite its countless malignancies? Just like it was the case with the great man theory, the answer here is equally straightforward. Idealism is the defining philosophy of the unchanging, established status quo, of the social and political forces that are devoted to preserving their hegemony by all means necessary. A philosophy that represents history as something static, theatrical, and episodic is very convenient for those who wish to represent their rule as omnipresent and all-encompassing, while painting potential social change and progress as something impossible, idealistic, and dangerous. Once you've skewed the dimension of time and torn apart the equation into thousands of atomized pieces, it becomes utterly impossible to perceive any motion or dynamic in the flow of history. Everything melts together. The socioeconomic arrangements of today begin to subconsciously seep into our retroactive investigation of history, so that by virtue of merely observing history from today's lens, we apply our superstitions and assumptions of contemporary politics onto that historical moment, dismissing all relevant historical context. And what is the result of this? Well, we begin to treat our current socioeconomic order as something eternal and omnipresent, as an expression of human nature that has always been with us and is part of who we are. As Mark Fisher puts it, the power of capitalist realism derives in part from the way that capitalism subsumes and consumes all of previous history. In other words, capitalism represents itself as the end-all be-all solution to human organization. It distorts and buries all alternative forms of organization from the past, and creates the impression that this is how things have always been, that humans have always been inherently greedy, profit-seeking, and ruthless by nature, and that, therefore, this is how things will always have to be. By rendering the evolution of human social and economic organization as something motionless and static, or linear and one-dimensional at best, by presenting history as it does today, capitalist business represents itself as something ontological and inherent to the very nature of humankind, as we have supposedly reached the end of history and there is no alternative. The ultimate result of all of this is that, as Frederick Jameson famously said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This kind of apathy conjures the impression that action is pointless. Only senseless hope makes sense. Superstition and religion, the first resorts of the helpless, proliferate. We can see how this kind of frozen outlook on history also paralyzes our collective imagination for any potential social change, for alternate modes of organization. It breeds political sterility and impotence, and renders us as passive observers of a theatrical play, steered primarily by important men in important moments, us being passive bystanders and observers. But thankfully there is an alternative to this apathy, one that breathes fresh air into the discourse about history, and by extension, about prospects for our future. This alternative offers us a historical model that is dynamic, modular, and constantly evolving, whose unceasing development is perceived in all of its complexity pertaining interconnectedness, interdependence, and causality. The philosophy that gives us the ability of such advanced analysis is namely dialectical materialism, whose core mechanisms I will try to explain in a couple of sentences, but which nonetheless deserves a much more nuanced conversation. I've already talked about the basics of dialectical and historical materialism in my video Are You Afraid of Communism? And there are many other amazing videos by, for example, the Marxist Project, that delve much deeper into this huge subject. If you in any way feel confused or intimidated by the concept, don't worry. It does take some time to digest, so take your time and be patient. Nonetheless, in short, this method entices us to view social relations, material phenomena, and, by extension, the entire universe as a series of contradictions. The resolvement of these contradictions through a dialectical synthesis of new phenomena results in qualitative and quantitative changes that are the driving force of historical progress. The application of the dialectical method onto history, the topic of this very video, is also known as historical materialism, according to which human history is a series of societal, economic, and political contradictions and clashes, whose ultimate expression comes in the form of class struggle between the possessing and laboring classes. Through this lens, it becomes apparent that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, and not random events and petty elitist politics that are out of our control. Nonetheless, in complete contrast to the lethargy of liberal idealism, with this method of investigation, we treat phenomena, events, and social forces as something fluid, shape-shifting, and ever-evolving, resistant to enclosure into rigid definitions inside the vacuum of the idealist mind. We thus derive historical definitions from material and social phenomena, instead of forcing bluntly predefined concepts onto the ever-changing material world. Instead of defining capitalism or communism with 5 clean bullet points and seeking the manifestation of this predefined concept in the material world, we observe the material conditions and processes that surround us and, out of sheer convenience, loosely define them for further simplification, knowing very well that in 10 years' time, our definition will likely need rigorous updating. This necessitates above all else the strict observation of the historical context, the material conditions of the era in question, when investigating a certain epoch. One must patiently consider the events that preceded and followed the given point in time, always seeking to understand the multidimensional causality of preceding, parallel, and following events. So, what does this entire pile of words and concepts mean concretely? Well, it means that we ought to observe history as a series of ever-evolving socioeconomic systems, with the Eurocentric model suggesting primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism as the general stages of development. Opposed to looking at history as a random series of personal political squabbles between elites and politicians, we herewith conclude that social classes are the ones fighting for hegemony and emancipation, with class struggle as the main vessel of social and economic change. Thus, forces of progress and those of reaction clash through their antagonistic interests and facilitate constant development. The core virtue of this entire philosophy is that it allows us to uncover the systemic causes of the issues that have plagued our societies throughout history, to unravel the secrets of our socioeconomic system with an X-ray that gives us insight into the background processes that usually go completely unnoticed through the traditional idealist lens. Just like a doctor is compelled to look at the root cause, the underlying disease of any symptom his patient may have, so are we compelled to examine the foundational sources of the problems with our social organism. And this can be done only with dialectical materialism. So, there we go. We've come to a conclusive ending to our critique of contemporary historical scholarship with a viable alternative in mind. It's important to keep in mind that these two opposing modes of thought, and by extension methods of investigating history, are diametrically opposed and cannot be reconciled. The historical evolution from idealism to dialectics as the highest mode of human thought has been well documented and can be traced through the works of dozens of philosophers from the 18th century up to today. In the spirit of its own tenets, it is an ever-evolving social science. So I urge you above all else to take a look at this development yourself and do your fair share of reading. Moreover, it's also worth mentioning that there will inevitably be those who unconditionally oppose even the consideration of an alternative mode of thought, who, out of their self-serving interests or perhaps irrational fear, cynically dismiss and slander about subjects that they, more often than not, don't even understand the basics of. This kind of derisive and sneering attitude is to be expected, and should be ignored for the most part, as long as it stays unconstructive or cynical. And finally, in case you're interested in seeing dialectical and historical materialism in action and applied to concrete, contemporary and historical contexts, well, I have an entire channel filled with videos that were written using these very methods. So make sure to take a look and leave your thoughts in the comments below.